Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's been in the news a lot lately. And honestly, I think it's something that's on a lot of people's minds. We're talking about the impact of social media on teenagers, and especially all the anxiety it seems to be creating. We'll be looking at an excerpt from a book by Werner Lee. It's called Adolescent Anxiety, a Social Media Pandemic. It's a really interesting look at the kinds of pressures young people are facing online these days. And honestly, I think it's relevant for just about anyone who wants to understand this generation a bit better.
Yeah, it's not just a surface level look at the issue either. Lee really gets into the psychology of it all, like how social media actually affects the mental health of teens. So we're going to be pulling out some of the key insights from the book to try to help everyone understand this complex issue a little bit better.
So the book starts off by talking about this kind of core tension I think a lot of us can relate to. Social media has all these amazing benefits, right? It
Yeah.
connects us, it keeps us informed, it can be a lot of fun. But at the same time, it's also causing this anxiety in young people in a way that we just haven't really seen before.
And one of the things that Lee talks about is this idea of overstimulation. Teenagers these days, they're constantly bombarded with images and messages and notifications and everything. It's like this nonstop stream of information. And, I can't help but think about what that's doing to their brains, especially as their brains are still developing, like how does that impact their sense of reality?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it reminds me of this one quote from the book that really stuck with me. It says, "Filtering of life into streamlined and concluded chapters can streamline and stall perceptions of low self-esteem, insecurity, or anxiety as we feel we ought to be achieving all that we see."
Sure.
It's like they're constantly comparing their own behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel, you know?
Exactly. And that feeds right into what we call FOMO, that fear of missing out. Teens are always seeing these perfect, curated versions of other people's lives, so they start to feel like they're not experiencing enough themselves. And that can easily lead to loneliness and anxiety.
And then on top of all that, you've got the issue of cyberbullying, which the book highlights as a really significant contributor to anxiety.
Right. And you know what Lee points out? Social media can give people this sense of anonymity. They feel like they're more distant from the person they're interacting with. So sadly, it kind of emboldens some people to become bullies.
Yeah, it's like they think they can get away with it more easily. So Lee defines this adolescent anxiety as this heightened sense of worry and fear that's directly linked to how teens interact online. He's saying it's not just the typical teenage angst we all went through, it's something different.
And the scale of the problem is pretty concerning. The book mentions the statistic from the American Psychological Association. And it says that almost half of all teenagers feel stressed because of the constant pressure they face online.
Wow, that's a really big number.
It is. It really shows us how urgent this problem is.
So let's dive into some of the factors that are contributing to all of this anxiety. The first one that Lee talks about is social comparison. It's this constant cycle of teens comparing themselves to their peers. And of course, everyone else's lives look perfect online, right?
Mhm.
Their vacations, their selfies, even their grades. It's never ending.
And then you add in the whole influencer phenomenon. These influencers often set these completely unrealistic standards for everything, for how people should look, how successful they should be, how happy they should be. I mean, how are teens supposed to compete with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I
Yeah.
mean, some level of social comparison is natural, right? It's part of being human.
Yeah.
But how do we help teenagers figure out what's healthy and what's not healthy?
That's what Lee's getting at. He argues that social media amplifies these comparisons to a really harmful degree. And teenagers, they're already going through so many changes. They're already dealing with so many insecurities, so they're especially vulnerable to all of this.
Okay, so we've got social comparison as one factor. What else is feeding into this rise in anxiety?
Well, we already touched on cyberbullying, but the book goes into some really specific examples, like harassment through online messages, purposely excluding someone from a group online, people creating fake profiles just to make fun of someone, and even something called doxing.
Doxing. I'm not sure what that means.
Oh, yeah, it's when someone shares someone else's personal information online, like their home address or their phone number, without their consent, of course. It's a way to try to scare or embarrass someone. It can be really scary for the person who's being doxxed. They feel totally exposed.
Yeah, that's awful. I can definitely see how that would cause a lot of anxiety.
Totally. It makes people feel vulnerable and afraid. And it can be hard to shake that feeling.
Okay, so we've got social comparison, we've got cyberbullying. What other major contributors does Lee talk about?
A big one is what we call FOMO, that fear of missing out. Lee argues that when you're always looking at these curated online feeds, it creates this false sense of reality. It seems like everyone's always having these amazing experiences.
Right, and you're just stuck at home doing your homework. I can see how that would be so frustrating for teens especially.
Exactly. Lee gives some examples of things that can trigger FOMO, like seeing pictures of parties that you weren't invited to, or your friends going on some exotic trip, or even just a casual hangout that you weren't a part of. It makes you question what's real and what's not.
Exactly. Are things really as perfect as they seem online? I think that's something we all need to think about more, especially when it comes to the young people in our lives.
Totally, awareness is the first step.
Okay, so we've got social comparison, cyberbullying, and FOMO. What else is contributing to all this teenage anxiety?
Well, there's one more thing. Lee calls it validation seeking. It's when teens start relying on likes and followers for their self-worth. And that can create so much anxiety when those expectations aren't met.
Oh, yeah, I get that. It's like their self-esteem depends on what other people think of them online, which is so unpredictable and unreliable.
Exactly, and this ties into a bigger point that Lee makes. He warns about the danger of connecting your sense of self-worth to what happens on social media. It can create this never-ending cycle of needing approval from other people, which can really damage real-life relationships and prevent you from feeling truly fulfilled.
That makes sense, but don't likes and comments also give people a sense of belonging, especially for teenagers who are often trying to figure out where they fit in?
That's a good point. I think it's all about finding a balance. It's not about saying that social media is all bad. It's about helping teenagers develop a healthier relationship with it.
So helping them enjoy the benefits without letting it take over their lives.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot.
Okay, so we've just scratched the surface of Lee's book here, and it's already painting a pretty intense picture of what teens are going through.
It is intense, but I think it's so important that we talk about these issues openly. That's the first step to finding solutions.
Before we move on, I'm wondering about the parents. How can they help their kids deal with all of this? I'm sure Lee has some advice for them, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's actually the focus of the next chapter. He offers some practical strategies for parents and caregivers to help them guide their teens through this whole social media world in a healthy and balanced way.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. I can't wait to dive into those strategies.
Me too. I think this next chapter is going to be really helpful for anyone who interacts with teenagers.
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll be jumping into Chapter 2, where Lee lays out these strategies for parents. So stay tuned.
All right, we're back. And I don't know about you, but my head is kind of spinning. We talked about a lot of heavy stuff in that last segment,
Yeah, we did. It's tough to hear about everything teens are dealing with online these days.
especially as a parent, right? Like you want to protect your kids, but you also, you can't exactly just ban social media. It's such a huge part of their lives.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's the challenge, right? How do you help them get the good parts of social media without all the risks? Well, luckily, that's exactly what Werner Lee addresses in the next chapter of his book.
Okay, so Chapter 2 is all about solutions. Let's hear it. What does Lee recommend?
Well, one of the first things he talks about is the importance of communication. Parents really need to make sure their kids feel comfortable talking to them about anything, about their experiences online, good or bad.
Okay, that sounds good in theory, but teenagers aren't always the most open people you know. How do you actually get them to talk about this stuff?
That's true. It's not always easy. But Lee gives some good advice in the book. He says instead of lecturing them, try asking them open-ended questions like, what are some things you like about social media? Or, have you ever seen anything online that made you feel uncomfortable?
Okay, so start with curiosity instead of going straight to judgment.
Exactly. It's about showing them that you care about their world and that you're there to listen without judging them.
I like that. What about boundaries? Any advice on setting those?
Oh yeah, that's a big one. Lee says it's super important to set clear guidelines around social media use. Things like setting screen time limits, having tech-free zones in the house, or even just being mindful of what kind of content they're consuming.
Right, it's like any other healthy habit. Right. Making sure they get enough sleep, eat healthy foods, have time for activities offline. Social media just needs to be part of that balance.
Exactly. Moderation is key.
But okay, what happens when things go wrong? Like if a teen is being bullied online, what does Lee say parents should do?
That's a really important question, and Lee has a whole section of the book dedicated to it. The first thing he says is that teens need to know how to report any kind of abuse. They need to know they're not alone and that there are people who can help.
So it's not just about telling them to ignore it.
No, definitely not ignoring it rarely makes things better. Lee gives specific steps for how to report things to social media platforms, how to gather evidence, even when it might be necessary to involve the police.
Wow, that's really helpful. It makes it a lot less scary for parents, too. But what about the emotional side of things? How can parents support their kids if they're feeling anxious or even traumatized by their experiences online?
That's where professional help can be really important. Lee talks about how therapy can help teens process what they've been through and learn how to cope with those difficult emotions. He even includes a list of resources in the book, like organizations and websites and hotlines that can offer support.
That's great to know because sometimes it's more than parents can handle on their own.
Yeah.
But hey, it's not all doom and gloom, right? Lee also talks about the good things about social media, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He reminds us that social media can be really powerful. It can help people connect with each other, express their creativity, even get involved in activism.
So how do we help teenagers use social media for good? Instead of just scrolling and comparing themselves to everyone else.
Lee has a simple suggestion. He says, encourage them to be mindful of who they follow online. Are those accounts inspiring them? Are they promoting positive values? Do they align with the teen's interests? It's about choosing to see content that lifts you up.
That's such a good point. It's like surrounding yourself with good people in real life.
Exactly. And Lee has another suggestion. He says, try to get involved in your teen's online activities. Not in a controlling way, but just to show that you're interested. Maybe you watch a funny video together or talk about a news article they shared, or even work on a creative project together.
It's like showing them that you care about what they're doing online.
Exactly. And it can open up some really great conversations. Plus, it models healthy social media behavior because teens are always watching us, whether we realize it or not.
So if we're always on our phones or comparing ourselves to others, they're going to pick up on that.
Exactly. We need to practice what we preach.
It's not just about telling them what to do. It's about showing them a better way.
Right. And that leads us perfectly into chapter 3, where Lee dives into the idea of building resilience and self-esteem in this digital age.
Okay, this is what I'm really curious about. We've talked about the problems and some strategies for parents, but how do you actually help teenagers feel good about themselves in a world that's so focused on image?
That's the big question, right? And Lee offers some really concrete strategies in this next chapter.
Well, I'm excited to hear them. Let's take a quick break and then we'll come back and dive into chapter 3. All right, so we're back and ready to tackle this idea of building resilience. Because honestly, that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Helping teens develop that inner strength to deal with all the challenges of social media.
Absolutely. It's like giving them the tools to navigate this online world without letting it affect their self-esteem.
Exactly. So let's dive into chapter 3 of Verner Lee's book, where he focuses on exactly that, resilience and self-esteem in the digital age.
Okay, so one of the key things Lee talks about is this idea of a growth mindset.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but can you explain exactly what it means?
Sure, so basically it's the belief that your abilities and intelligence aren't fixed. They can actually grow and develop over time through effort and learning.
Okay, I see. And how does that relate to social media?
Well, social media often encourages this idea that you're either a winner or a loser based on how many likes or followers you have. It promotes this fixed mindset.
So with a growth mindset, you're not as worried about all that. You're more focused on learning and improving yourself.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that you're always evolving and your worth isn't tied to some number on a screen.
I love that idea. But how do you actually teach teenagers to think that way?
Well, Lee gives some really practical advice for parents. For example, you can encourage them to see challenges as opportunities for growth instead of being afraid of failure.
So if they don't get the grade they wanted, or their post doesn't get a lot of likes, it's not the end of the world. It's a chance to learn and do better next time.
Exactly. And it's important to praise their effort and determination, not just the end result.
That makes sense. It's about helping them feel in control of their own lives.
Right. And that sense of agency is so important for building self-esteem.
Okay, so we've got the growth mindset. What else does Lee suggest for boosting self-esteem in this digital age?
He talks about the importance of helping teens identify their strengths and qualities, the things that make them unique and valuable, regardless of what's happening on social media.
It's like reminding them that they are more than just their online persona.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful message. It's about fostering self-acceptance and self-love.
That's so important, but it's also really hard, isn't it? Especially when social media is constantly showing us these perfect images.
It is a challenge, but Lee suggests focusing on values and passions. Help your teen figure out what's truly important to them. Help them define their own definition of success and happiness.
So they're not just chasing after whatever's trendy or popular
It's
online.
exactly. It's about finding their own inner compass.
And I imagine strong relationships are important too, right? Real life connections, not just online ones.
Absolutely. Lee emphasizes that a lot. Family, friends, mentors, these relationships can provide a sense of grounding and support.
It's a reminder that you're loved and valued for who you are, not for how many followers you have.
Right. And these strong relationships can also help teens develop critical thinking skills.
Oh, that's interesting. How so?
Well, they need to be able to evaluate the information they're seeing online, not just believe everything at face value.
So being able to spot fake news and recognize when someone's trying to manipulate them.
Exactly. It's about being media literate.
And I guess that ties into emotional regulation too, right?
Yeah.
Being able to deal with the stress and anxiety that social media can cause.
Absolutely. Lee talks about the importance of mindfulness and self-care, things like exercise, spending time in nature, meditation, anything that helps them relax and de-stress.
It's about having those tools to cope with the ups and downs of the online world.
Exactly. Self-care is so important for everyone, but especially for teenagers who are still learning how to manage their emotions.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the challenges teens are facing online to strategies for parents and caregivers. And of course, these really important ideas about building resilience and self-esteem.
Yeah, it's been a really insightful conversation.
If you want to learn more about this topic, we highly recommend checking out Werner Lee's book, Adolescent Anxiety, A Social Media Pandemic. It's full of research, practical tips, and inspiring stories. And honestly, I think it's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand this generation better.
I agree. It's a really valuable resource.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you